What else, sports fans? I'm Rydok and I'm here to level up your Blood Bowl game. Last week we talked about all the basics involved in throwing a block. Well, this week we're going to tackle all of the skills that turn your basic block into the true art of blocking. A quick note before we get going, guys, I'm still running the giveaway for that Human Nobility team. So if you haven't already had a chance to subscribe and comment on that video, then up here is the link to it. Don't forget to hit that, but wait until the end of the video and go back for that one. You don't want to miss out on what we're about to do. Now I'm going to do my best here to get all of these skills in under 10 minutes, so we've got a clock going, but I won't know if we have until the end, but fingers crossed. And let's go! Within Blood Bowl there are 5 skill categories: General, Strength, Agility, Passing and Mutation. Now within each of these categories there are 12 individual skills, so there are 60 skills in total. Now 21 of these 60 skills, so a third, are all related to blocking alone. There's no better place to start our list than with the most popular skill in the game, so that is block. Now up here I have done an entire video on the block skill from the previous edition, but it still stands, nothing has changed there. And the reason this skill is so important is it allows a player with block to ignore the both down result on the block dice. This means the player is safer to throw or to receive a block, as they have reduced the chances of either turning over throwing the block or being knocked down when receiving a block. Wrestle is a very similar skill to blocking. It affects the same dice roll, that both down result, but instead of ignoring the result, you can instead choose to wrestle both players involved in the block to the floor without anyone taking an injury. Wrestle works in a similar way to block in that it affects the both down result on a dice, but instead of ignoring the result, it allows you to wrestle both players to the floor, placing both players prone, but no one takes an injury and there's no armor dice rolled. This also unusually doesn't cause a turnover when you put one of your own players on the floor, and it overrules block, so a wrestle player can use wrestle to bring a block player down. The key use for this wrestle skill is to actually bring down a block player, either a ball carrier or to other players with block. This isn't the best skill to be giving your ball carriers, but it is the best skill to be giving your ball hawks. These are the players that go after the opposing ball carriers. The wrestle giving you a far better chance of getting that player on the floor and making them drop the ball. Fend is the next skill on our list, and this affects the push part of a block. Players with Fend can choose whether or not they would like the player that's blocked them to have the choice to follow up. Now this is a hard counter to the Frenzy skill that we'll cover next, and is a useful skill for ball carriers and pieces that you don't want to take too many blocks. It's purely a defensive skill, has no offensive uses, and is quite a common skill. Frenzy is one of only 2 skills that allow you to throw more than 1 block per turn. If, after having thrown your first block, your opponent isn't knocked down, then you get the opportunity to throw a second block. Regardless of the result, if you push your opponent back, a player with Frenzy has to follow up. They have no choice unless the Fend skill stops them. Now you do have to bear in mind your blocking assists with using a Frenzy player, because whilst you might allow enough assists to get 2 dice on the first block, when you follow up and make that second block, you might then find yourself throwing an uphill block or a 1 dice block depending on the positioning. It's this reason that I don't recommend Frenzy to newer players, and it's best suited to Strength 4 and above players to minimise those 1 dice or uphill blocks that result from the second follow-up block. Dauntless is a skill that works on a block or a blitz, and it affects the strength of the player throwing the block. If your blocking piece is weaker than the piece they're blocking, so an ordinary and uphill block, you can roll for Dauntless, which is a d6, add your strength, and if the total of this is greater than the strength of the player you are blocking, then your strengths become equal. Now this is resolved before you apply any defensive or defensive assists, so essentially either if there are no assists it becomes a 1 dice block, if there are assists then you treat these as normal. Failing the Dauntless roll simply means that Dauntless doesn't apply, and then you count your assists if there are any and resolve the block as if the Dauntless hadn't been there. If you have a skill like Frenzy that allows you to throw more than 1 block per turn, you roll Dauntless for each individual block. Strip Ball is an interesting, purely offensive skill that only works against ball carriers. When you throw a block against a ball carrier, assuming you've ended up with a push either through a natural push or a defender stumbles against a dodge piece, you push the player back and then they drop the ball from the square you've pushed them into. This is very handy when you're trying to get a ball loose from the opponent, but it is hard countered by sure hands, meaning that a player with sure hands cannot be strip balled. This synergy between strip ball and sure hands makes strip ball very useful when it comes into play, but less commonly taken because of the prevalence of sure hands. Tackle is a key skill, especially when you're running into high agility and high dodge teams. It has two applications, but it only does one thing. Tackle cancels the dodge skill. So if a player has dodge and you roll a defender stumbles, that is treated as a push rather than a knockdown. But when you apply tackle as the blocking player, your opponent cannot use their dodge and that defender stumbles is a pan. Outside of the block, tackle still cancels dodge, so if a player is trying to leave the tackle zone of a player with tackle, they don't get to use their dodge skill reroll. It doesn't stop them from using a team reroll for that dodge though. Those are all of our general skills, and most players in the game have access to general. Stunties don't, and most big guys don't. But across the board, general skills are available to the vast majority of players. Next up for us is agility skills, and these are available to the next largest group of players, and that does include the stunties. Dodge is a very useful skill, and it combines marvellously with block to reduce the number of times you get your players knocked over. Dodge turns the defender stumbles dice result into a push, which is not a bad result usually. You can choose not to use it, but this only really occurs if you're at risk of being pushed off of the pitch. Again, outside of the block, it gives you a reroll for making a dodge attempt, as long as your opponent doesn't have tackle. Jump up also has a couple of uses. We'll cover the easy one first. Usually when you stand up from being prone, it uses 3 squares of movement. But jump up removes those 3 squares, giving you your full allowance of movement. Now when you combine this with a blitz, it means you can get up, throw your blitz and move up to your full movement as if you had been stood up as normal. But it also has a secondary use. If a player is prone but would like to make a block against an adjacent player, not a blitz, you can attempt to make that block by making a jump up block. And this is an agility roll with a +1 modifier. So if we look at our human lineman, he's doing this on a 2+. If you pass your result, you jump up, throw your block as normal, and you can follow up as normal. So essentially this is a normal block action as if you had been stood up at the start of your turn. If you fail the agility roll, so in this case we rolled the 1, your player remains lying on the floor and that is the end of their activation. You've got no other chance to get them stood up. Sidestep affects the squares available when you're getting pushed. So normally you can be pushed either straight back into 3 squares or diagonally into 3 squares. But with sidestep you can be pushed into any of the 8 adjacent squares to your player. Now this applies whether you're being pushed or knocked over, not with a both down though. And the choice of this square is the sidestep player or the player being knocked over. So we treat this as a defensive skill rather than an offensive skill. Now if you thought I'd made blocking assists complicated last week, well now I've got 2 skills that make it even more complicated than before. One is an agility skill, defensive, and one is a strength skill, guard. I'm going to treat these 2 skills together because they do work in conjunction. Now I'm going to break the sequence here and deal with guard first because that will make explaining defensive easier. Players with guard can provide a blocking assist even when they themselves are marked. So if we had some guard in last week's homework, that would have changed the blocking results because you can provide more assists with guard. It is a super powerful skill that gets more impressive the more of it you have. 1 guard is nice, 5 guard is very strong, 11 guard is almost impossible to counter apart from having more guard. That was until the 2nd season arrived and brought with it the new defensive skill. Now hopefully I can get this point across easily, but this is a complex situation. Defensive cancels guard on your opponent's turn. So this means when you are receiving blocks from your opponent, they are unable to use their guard assists if you have a defensive player in position to cancel those guard assists. But when you are the attacking player and you are making those blocks, your opponent can use his guard assists as a defensive assist. Now these 2 skills greatly affect the blocking homework I set last week. And if you guys would like some more examples, drop those in the comments below. I'll come up with some more examples with and without guard and with and without defensive for you guys to work through. Our 3rd largest category of skills are the strength skills, available to all of the big guys, and usually 1 or possibly 2 player types in some teams, but when it comes to those elf teams, they don't have access to this on a primary skill up. Probably the most powerful skill in the game, and the 3rd most common behind block and guard, is Mighty Blow. So far we haven't tackled what happens when you knock a player down, so I'm going to cover it briefly here. Every time a player hits the floor, whether that is through a block action, a failed rush or a failed dodge, you roll against their armour, which if we bring back our player card, is a target roll, same as agility, and it's usually 8 to 10 plus, though there are some outliers at either side of that. Now what Mighty Blow allows you to do is add +1 to the roll when trying to beat someone's armour, and more importantly, if you don't need that +1 to break their armour, it allows you to have +1 on the roll against their injury. Now there is some debate on the skill progression for Mighty Blow. I like to take it after block, but it is true that players that start with Mighty Blow or take it as their first skill will accrue star player points faster, but they have a higher risk of turning over during their block actions. Brawler is another new skill for the new season, and you could consider this to be poor man's block. It doesn't replace it, but it does affect that both down dice result. So when your Brawler players throw a block, but importantly not a blitz, you can re-roll 1 both down result per turn. This would allow you to potentially avoid a turnover, but if you happen to have block or wrestle, you could still re-roll that result if you were looking for something else. Now it might seem that this isn't as good as block, and it isn't, but it doesn't come in the general category, it comes in the strength category, meaning it's available to all of the big guys in the game who don't naturally have general skill access. So your ogres, your trolls, those guys can pick up Brawler on a primary skill, making them far safer to use during your turns. Grab is a skill that works in a very similar way to sidestep, and there's a very interesting synergy that works between the two. When your grab player throws a block, they can choose the square you push the opposing player into from one of the 8 surrounding squares rather than the usual 3. Now these squares do have to be empty, and if there are no empty squares then the skill isn't used and the push is treated as normal. But when it comes to hitting one of those sidestep players, grab overrules sidestep, and in the case of a push here, the grab player would choose the square and the sidestep player doesn't have the option. It's important to note that when using a grab player with a blitz, you cancel sidestep but don't get to choose a grab square. So blitzing with grab follows the traditional 3 square push options. Juggernaut is one of those skills that only works on a blitz, and it has a couple of uses. The first and probably most common is to turn a both down result into a push if you want it to. So this is really good for a player that doesn't have block and doesn't have regular access to it like a big guy. Though now with the addition of Brawler as a strength skill, we might see Juggernaut taken slightly less often. The second part of this is that your opponent can't use their stand firm, wrestle or fend skills whilst receiving a Juggernaut blitz. Now this would work really well with a frenzy piece such as a rat ogre or a minotaur, because it means you cannot be fended off, giving you guaranteed access to your second block. Multiple block, or more often shortened to multi-block, allows you to make 2 blocks against 2 adjacent opposing players. So not a blitz, bear in mind this is only a standard stationary block. And in a big change from the 2016 rules, the blocking player now has a -2 strength penalty. In the previous edition, both opposing players gained +2 strength. So there's a slight difference, and it's more likely to affect the number of blocking dice and those opportunities where you might have made 3 block dice. Now both of these blocks are resolved simultaneously, so the result of one block doesn't affect the other block. If you turn over here, you still make the second block, even though you were still having a turnover for that team turn. But to make things simpler, we do resolve one block and then resolve the other block. We just bear in mind that they happen at the same time. Regardless of the outcome of the various blocks, you cannot follow up to either block. You have to remain where you are, and using this skill does stop you from using the frenzy skill. So there might be a few interesting situations where you don't want to frenzy and you can multi-block instead to stop that from happening. But with that -2 strength penalty, it's probably best suited to stronger players, so ogres, trolls, tree men, but the strength penalty is applied before assists are calculated, so it is still more than possible to get those 2 dice blocks on both blocks with clever use of assists and possibly guard. Stand firm is another skill that affects the push side of a block. These players can choose whether or not they would like to be pushed as part of the block result. Now this does apply to a block or a knockdown from a defender stumbles or a pow. So rather than the traditional 3 square pushback, you can just reset remain where you are and either not be pushed if it's a push, a null result, or be knocked down in the square you currently stand. It is worth noting that whilst you might stand firm, this doesn't cancel the second frenzy block if a player's hit you with frenzy. They still get to throw their second block as if they had followed up, even though they haven't. But this is one of the times you might choose not to use stand firm, because that second block square might be more to your advantage than it is to the frenzy player. And with that, we get to move on to our final category of skills, and these are the mutation skills. Now these are fairly powerful, but rarely seen because there are only 5 or 6 teams that have access to mutations. And the one that's taken the biggest change from previous edition is Claw or Claws. When rolling for armour dice after a block using claws, you treat everyone's armour as 8+, assuming their armour was more than that to start with. So if you're blocking a halfling with a 7+ armour roll, you don't use it. If you're blocking an Amazon with an 8+ armour roll, that has no effect. If you're blocking a human lineman with a 9+ armour roll, you get to improve that to 8+. And this applies up the scale, so if you're blocking an 11+ tree man, he is still an 8+ to break. So you might be thinking, well, that's really effective, and it is very effective. But when it comes to the changes, you can no longer combine this with the Mighty Blow +1 for an armour roll that you could in previous editions. It doesn't stop you from applying Mighty Blow to the injury roll though, and you can choose which skill you would like to use. So if you do have Claw and Mighty Blow and you are blocking that halfling, we know Claw has no effect, so you might as well use the Mighty Blow instead to give you a better chance of breaking the armour. As you could imagine, getting some weird and funky mutations on your players could make them pretty horrible to look at, and that's where Foul Appearance comes in. This is a purely defensive skill that makes it more difficult for your opponents to block your players. So before you even get to roll any dice, your opponent's blocking players need to roll a d6 scoring a 2+ in order to allow the block. If they do roll a 1 here, then nothing happens. They are unable to throw the block because your player is so disgusting to look at, and their activation is over. It's one of those skills that you don't see taken very often as part of a skill progression, but players like Nurgle Warriors start with it, and that helps to keep these guys alive. Our final skill, and another new skill in the mutation line, is Iron Hard Skin, and this only has one application. It is a hard counter for Claw, so a player with Claw cannot apply their claws to a player with Iron Hard Skin, which makes this a very niche skill available to a very small number of teams, who all have access to the Claw as well. So whilst this would have been a really nice skill to see in a different category, so available to the full range of teams, it's limited purely to those mutation teams, and I think that means this skill will almost never be taken. There are far more useful skills across the categories than taking Iron Hard Skin for those few occasions you're going to run into a Claw player. Now, fifth and final category of skills are the passing skills, and I've left this to last because it doesn't really include any block related skills. There is a dump off in there which allows a pass as part of receiving a block, but I will cover that with passing rather than blocking because that is where it's more relevant. And that's it, that's all of our skills. What does the clock say? Did we do it in time? You tell me, because I have no idea at this point. Well, that was a run through of the skills, wasn't it, guys? Hopefully I got it under the 10 minutes for you, but we'll have to wait and see in the edit. Now, when it comes to your starting rosters, you don't need to worry about all of these skills because not all of them are skills that players start with, but bear in mind that Block, Wrestle, Brawler, Tackle and Mighty Blow for those big guys are going to be seen relatively frequently. So if you need to, wind back, have another read up of those. Now, if you're catching this video just as it's going live, then bear in mind that we are still running the giveaway for the Human Nobility team. So click up here if you would like to enter that draw. If not, then thank you very much for already hitting that subscribe button and like this video as well if you don't mind. Next week we're going to move on to the passing side of the game, which is the aspect of the game taking the biggest change from Blood Bowl 2016 to New Blood Bowl 2020, so there's going to be quite a lot to cover there, but I will try and squeeze the skills in as well. But until then guys, thank you very much for watching. If you click over here, you'll get the how-to blocking video from last week, and I will see you guys next time very soon.